Good afternoon. So today I will be presenting about generational trauma and more specifically how it's transmissed across generations. So generational trauma is also known as intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, and this refers to the psychological effects of trauma that are passed down from one generation to the next. According to the American Psychological Association, it is defined as the transmission of trauma or its legacy in the form of psychological consequence of an injury or attack, poverty, and so forth, from the generation experiencing the trauma to subsequent generations. But how does this actually happen? How can the impact of something like war, displacement, or abuse, or systematic oppression affect the generations that come afterwards? People who weren't even alive when the original trauma occurred can show severe mental impacts. So there are many theories and debates that suggest mechanisms of the transmission of generational impact, such as nature versus nurture debate, which references the role that one's DNA and environment play in their development. In reference to generational trauma, the nature versus nurture refers to epigenetics and early life experiences. Epigenetics are changes in the ways that your DNA sequence not is made up, not the combination of your DNA sequence, but how it's expressed. Additionally, the attachment theory discusses the role of the relationship one has with their caregiver in the development of unresolved trauma. So unresolved trauma on the part of the parent can lead to a vicious cycle of disorganized attachment and mental disorders in the subsequent generation. So the nature versus nurture debate was first coined by Francis Galton in the mid-1800s. However, the debate has ancient roots in the theories of Plato and Aristotle. Plato believed that people are born with certain traits and knowledge. This is the nature, while Aristotle argued that the mind begins with a blank slate and one's character comes from experiences. Nurture. Today, modern science shows us that it's not one or the other. Epigenetics demonstrates how genetic expression can be influenced by environmental factors, supporting the idea that nature and nurture are deeply interconnected. Likewise, early life experiences such as parenting, stress, or trauma have lasting effects on the development of mental health of the following generations. So epigenetics refers to how genes are expressed without altering the underlying DNA sequence. In other words, the genetic code remains the same, but environmental factors can influence whether certain genes are turned on or off. These changes can occur through mechanisms like DNA methylation or histomodification. What's particularly important, though, is that these epigenetic changes can be heritable. This means that they can be passed down from one generation to the next. This offers a compelling explanation for how experiences, especially traumatic or highly stressful experiences, can have lasting biological effects across generations. Research increasingly shows that epigenetic mechanisms contribute to the development of numerous mental health disorders, including schizophrenia, depression, or bipolar disorder. These conditions have complex origins involving both genetic vulnerability and environmental stressors. And epigenetics helps us understand how these two domains interact. For example, in the case of depression, one key mechanism is the dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And early life stressors, such as childhood trauma or neglect, can alter the epigenetic regulation of genes involved in the stress response system. This dysregulation can lead to heightened or blunted cortisol response, which is frequently observed in individuals with major depressive disorder. Additionally, research has shown that individuals with schizophrenia share very similar epigenetic profiles, thus suggesting that similar epigenetic changes contribute to the development of this disorder. Early life stressors such as trauma, neglect, or chronic adversity can lead to lasting brain abnormalities that increase the risk of developing mental health disorders. These early life experiences affect how the brain processes stress and emotions, making individuals more vulnerable to conditions like depression, anxiety, or PTSD. Mental health disorders are heritable, meaning genetic predispositions can be passed down from one generation to the next. However, genetics alone doesn't tell the entire story. The environment a child grows up in, especially the family environment, plays a crucial role in shaping mental health outcomes. A dysfunctional family environment plays a huge role in the development of mental health disorders, as one's parenting styles can affect the development of the attachment styles formed later on in life by their children. Children raised in such environments often experience repeated exposure to trauma, which can influence their own environmental regulation and coping strategies. The cycle of trauma and stress is transmitted not only through genetics, but also through learned behaviors, parenting styles, and emotional patterns within families. Over time, it's more likely to be passed down through generations. This is where attachment theory becomes particularly relevant. Attachment theory emphasizes how early bonds between children and caregivers influence patterns of emotional regulation, interpersonal relationships, and resilience. Attachment theory was first proposed by John Bowley in the 1950s as a groundbreaking framework for understanding the critical emotional bonds formed between infants and their primary caregivers. Bowley emphasized that these early bonds are essential for a child's survival and emotional development by shaping the way that the infant reacts with the parent and then later on their later relationships that they make in life. Mary Ainsworth in the 1970s conducted influential research that further refined the theory. She developed the strange situation experiment, a structured observational study designed to assess the infant caregiver attachment by observing how infants react to a series of separations and reunions with their caregiver in an unfamiliar environment. Through this experiment, Ainsworth identified 3 of the primary 4 attachment styles that reflect different patterns of relating and emotional regulation: secure attachment, anxious preoccupied attachment, and avoidant dismissive attachment. The 4th style, disorganized attachment, was discovered in 1986 by Mary Main and Judith Solomon while they were performing Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiment. It's important to note that parents' attachment styles and the trauma that parents experience can impact how they relate to their child, which can thus impact how they relate to their children later on in life, thus continuing the cycle of unhealthy attachment and mental health disorders. So the 4 attachment styles. First, secure attachment. When caregivers are consistently responsive, sensitive, and emotionally available, this is what would characterize secure attachment. Children with secure attachments learn to trust others and regulate their emotions effectively. This secure base fosters resilience, making it less likely for trauma to be transmitted to the next generation. Securely attached parents tend to provide stable and nurturing environments, which can interrupt cycles of trauma and promote healing. In contrast, anxious preoccupied attachment often arises when caregivers are inconsistent, sometimes attentive, sometimes neglectful. Children with this style become hypervigilant to signs of rejection or abandonment, leading to heightened anxiety and clinginess. These children may grow up struggling with emotional regulation and have difficulties in their own relationships, potentially reproducing patterns of instability and anxiety in their own parenting. This inconsistency can perpetuate trauma across generations through emotional dysregulation and insecure relational patterns. Furthermore, the avoidant dismissive attachment style typically develops when caregivers are emotionally distant or rejecting. Children learn to suppress their need for closeness and rely heavily on self-soothing. As adults, individuals with avoidant attachment may struggle to connect emotionally or provide the sensitive caregiving needed to foster secure attachment styles in their own children. This emotional distance can contribute to a cycle where trauma remains unacknowledged and unresolved, passing silently from parent to child through a lack of unemotional awareness. Finally, disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment can perpetuate generational trauma most intensely because it reflects a breakdown in the ability to form safe, coherent relational bonds. Parents with disorganized attachment may struggle with unresolved trauma themselves, making it difficult to provide stable caregiving, thereby continuing the cycle of trauma. So let's take a closer look at how attachment theory helps us understand the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Caregivers who have experienced unresolved trauma often struggle to form secure attachment with their children, but this is not necessarily due to lack of love or effort, but because trauma can interfere with emotional regulation and the ability to respond consistently and sensitively to a child's needs. When a caregiver is emotionally unavailable or even frightening, it disrupts the child's sense of safety and stability in the relationship. Over time, this leads to the development of insecure or disorganized attachment styles, where the child may feel conflicted about seeking comfort or connection. These early relational experiences are internalized, shaping how a child pursues relationships later on in life. This also influences how they regulate emotions, manage stress, and, again, form relationships later on in life. Children who grow up with these patterns are at greater risk for anxiety and depression and difficulties with identity and trust. As adults, they may unconsciously repeat similar patterns in their own relationships and parenting. This can contribute to the development of such mental health disorders strongly associated with attachment trauma, such as eating disorders, where control and self-image are central issues, borderline personality disorder, which involves fear of abandonment and emotional instability, and alcohol use disorder, where substances may be used to self-soothe or escape overwhelming emotions. This is how trauma becomes embedded, not just in individuals, but across generations, repeated through relational patterns. In conclusion, it's important to recognize how deeply the threads of nature and nurture are woven into the fabric of intergenerational trauma. On one hand, biological inheritance, our genetics, can pass down vulnerabilities such as heightened stress response or predispositions to anxiety or depression. On the other hand, on one hand, biological inheritance or genetics can pass down vulnerabilities such as heightened stress response or predispositions to anxiety or depression. This is the nature side. Trauma can literally alter our DNA expression through mechanisms like epigenetics, impacting how we respond to stress and regulate emotion. But this is only half the picture. The nurture side is just as powerful. Through early life relationships and the bonds we form with their caregivers and early life experiences, it can shape how we regulate emotions and form bonds later on in life. Attachment theory becomes crucial here. If a parent's own trauma has gone unaddressed, it can shape their parenting behaviors, perhaps through emotional unavailability, unpredictability, or even overprotection, unintentionally transmitting their distress to the next generation. Together, these dynamics create a cycle. Trauma reshapes not only our biology, but our behaviors, how we parent, how we connect, and how we cope. And without intervention, these patterns can repeat themselves across generations, creating ongoing psychological distress. Understanding the interplay of nature versus nurture and the role of attachment gives us a roadmap, not just for understanding where generational trauma comes from, but also how we can begin to break the cycle. Thank you.
Were there specific, in any of these sources here, that studied specific instances of intergenerational trauma? For example, I've recently studied American Indian boarding schools, and so was there any of these studies that looked at a particular group of people, or Vietnam War veterans, Nazi Holocaust prisoners? Were any of these studies looking at a particular group and coming up with these conclusions?
I looked more into the overview of how it's transmissed, but some of these did mention that in instances like that, it was like generational trauma was extremely prevalent. There was a book that I read called Psychopathology, and it basically listed a bunch of symptoms and like mental health disorders, and some of those gave examples of certain groups of people.
Did you come across anything, or what studies are out there? What would be the best study to kind of look at these epigenetics, where you have two individuals that have the same DNA but maybe have different experiences, so then maybe there's some different gene expression going on?
I found a really interesting one on the National Institute of Health that broke down first what epigenetics was, how it worked, and then looked specifically at generational trauma. And it didn't say like two people with very similar like genetic, but it did go into depth about how those epigenetic experiences can change how your genes are expressed, thus making you more like susceptible to certain mental illnesses.
Yeah, and they're I don't know if there's any on specifically looking at intergenerational trauma, but twin studies are like the best thing for looking at epigenetics, because you have two people that have exactly the same DNA, and then just from, like you were saying, their nurture part is a little bit different, so it's cool to look at. And then another question, so there's a lot of traumatic things happening around the world right now. One that comes to mind is the famine that's happening in Gaza and anywhere else. Can you speak to how this kind of like passed on trauma from these things, how you think they might influence a country overall as it's like moving and progressing and trying to move forward, especially after it has some really big event like this happening?
Yes, for sure. I'm like super big about a holistic approach to solving certain global problems, especially when it comes to like homelessness, illness, like that kind of thing. Because obviously we have to acknowledge the mental impacts it has as well, or else we're not fully addressing the problem. I think we will definitely see at least some effect of generational trauma or just trauma in general in those areas. Because I mean, you see it in the areas of Europe that were impacted heavily by certain like wars and stuff. Like I know Germany during World War II, you see certain attitudes or certain tendencies that just kind of hint back to that generational trauma.
Did you come across in any of the studies, like if one parent's trauma is more prevalent in impacting a child than another's?
I didn't.
Like mom and dad coming together to.
Right. Mhm. No, I didn't specifically see if there was any dominance between the mother or the dad.
Caroline, kind of going off of what Mrs. Buckley just asked you, but moving from a global scale to a local scale, I would think that like supporting new parents programs and things that can educate parents on kind of some of the positive ways to form attachments with their children would be a really important thing to have as a local resource. Given maybe some experience that other people in the room have had with some of those programs, can you just talk about what we have as resources locally here for parents?
We have some really good resources. We have Healthy Start, I know of, that works with new parents and children in supplying medical, psychological, financial help and like teaches them how to work their books and stuff like that. I think it's definitely a really important thing to address because if we don't help the parents help themselves, it's just going to continue this cycle and they won't be able to help their children.
It's kind of connection, a possible connection with Kelly's study.
Mm-hmm.
Why are teens so depressed when they're dealing with all of this, generational trauma coming down on
Mm-hmm.
not knowing what's happening?
So one thing I was thinking of, and I think we talked when you were, coming up with this idea is how do you think this plays into when people talk about like family curses? Like how, because like, oh, everyone in my family is like never gonna get married, and then like nobody in the family ever got married. So like how might that play? How might this information play into kind of more of these like unfounded statements that like have just been passed down from generation to generation?
Some might definitely be absurd, but some definitely have some concrete root that can go back to some trauma that their ancestors experienced that create this like chain of severe mental illness, depression, anxiety, like suicide, like substance abuse that can just cause maybe what they think is a curse, but it more roots back to their mental health of their ancestors, and the things that they experience.
So you're saying curses are real. That's what I just heard. That's what I just heard. Thank you.
What happens if people are not aware or they are in denial about their trauma? How does that work?
That can definitely significantly impact, because whether you want to acknowledge it or not, like you might have trauma and it's important to deal with it, and so if it goes unresolved, it can turn into this generational trauma where it can have impact on your children or even those surrounding you.
Is there any agreed upon definition of what a traumatic event is? I mean, there's an element of subjectivity, I would think, that goes into it, but there's probably some things that we would all 100% agree on. I don't know if anyone ever tried to kind of pinpoint what that might be.
I didn't look specifically into that. I looked more into the like war, displacement, like the big ticket items. I didn't specifically look at that, but.
Any other questions?
Caroline, if you had the opportunity to continue this research, what are some areas that you find promising or that you want to continue to learn about?
I definitely want to look more into the current treatment we have and maybe some of the patient profiles of people like currently undergoing this to see what kind of correlation, because even though like I talked about some develop schizophrenia, some like it's depression, like it can be so different. Like I want to more look into like even like the epigenetic profiles of those individuals, not just individuals with the same mental health disorder, but different, to see if that is impacting in any way.
Has it spurred you to look at your family history?
My family history is what spurred me to look at this. Yes.